One day you just stop showing up. You cancel plans you would have forced yourself through 6 months ago. You let the phone ring. You leave messages unread for hours, then days, then without guilt. The people who've known you longest start asking each other what's wrong, because this version of you, the one who doesn't rush to fill every silence, who doesn't appear at every gathering with energy she can't afford, is someone they've never met, and they don't know what to do with her. Jung noticed this pattern in a specific kind of patient, the ones who had spent years, sometimes decades, pouring themselves into the emotional lives of everyone around them, the helpers, the listeners, the ones everyone leaned on. They'd arrive in his office not in crisis exactly, but in a state he found far more interesting than crisis. They'd gone quiet. They'd pulled back from their entire social world, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in slow increments that only became visible in retrospect. And rather than diagnosing this as withdrawal or avoidance, Jung paid attention to what was actually happening underneath. What he found was that this disappearance wasn't a symptom of something breaking. It was a symptom of something finally beginning to work. The empath's psyche, after years of being oriented entirely outward, toward other people's needs, other people's emotions, other people's emergencies, was turning inward for the first time. And the inward turn demanded solitude the way a fever demands rest. You couldn't negotiate with it. You couldn't schedule it for a more convenient time. It simply arrived, and you either honored it or you got sicker. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung understood about the empath's disappearance, why it happens, what's actually taking place during those weeks or months of silence, why the people around you react the way they do, and what the quiet comeback looks like when you finally re-emerge. Because if you're in the middle of this right now, if you've been pulling away and you can't fully explain why, what I'm about to describe will sound less like theory and more like someone reading your journal. The disappearance usually starts before the empath recognizes it as a disappearance. It starts as fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, a heaviness after social interactions that used to feel normal. You leave a dinner with friends, and instead of feeling recharged, you sit in your car for 10 minutes before you can drive. You hang up a phone call and realize your jaw has been clenched the entire time. Your body starts refusing things your mind still thinks it wants. Jung would have called this the body's rebellion against a false arrangement. The empath has been living according to a structure that was never actually theirs. Their availability, their warmth, their willingness to absorb and process other people's emotional weight, these weren't personality traits. They were survival strategies built in childhood, when being attuned to everyone else's needs was the price of safety. And the body, after carrying that arrangement for 20 or 30 or 40 years, starts sending signals that it's done. The signals are easy to misread. The empath thinks they're depressed. Their friends think they're angry. Their family thinks something happened, a breakup, a job loss, some event that explains the retreat. But often, nothing happened. That's what makes it so confusing for everyone, including the empath. There's no inciting incident. There's just a slow, full-body refusal to keep performing a role that was never chosen consciously. This is the part that scares people, because the empath who starts disappearing doesn't look like someone healing. They look like someone falling apart. They stop initiating contact. They lose interest in the dynamics that used to consume them. Who's upset? Who needs support? Who's in crisis this week? Problems they would have absorbed and tried to solve now float past them like weather reports from a country they've stopped visiting. And the people who depended on that absorption don't experience it as the empath getting healthier. They experience it as abandonment. Jung observed this dynamic repeatedly and found it almost universal. When the empath begins to withdraw, the system around them destabilizes. Because the empath wasn't just a person in that system, they were a function. They were the regulator, the processor, the emotional utility everyone else plugged into without realizing it. Remove the utility, and suddenly everyone has to feel their own feelings, manage their own anxiety, sit with their own discomfort. And most people don't want to do that, so they pressure the empath to come back. The pressure takes predictable forms. Guilt. You've changed. You're being selfish. I don't even know you anymore. Concern that's really control. I'm worried about you often translates to, I'm uncomfortable without access to you. Sometimes the pressure is more subtle. People who suddenly develop emergencies that require the empath's attention, pulling them back into the old role through crisis. Jung recognized this as the system's immune response, trying to neutralize the threat of change. And here's where empaths face their first real test during the disappearance. Because everything in their conditioning tells them to respond, to explain themselves, to reassure everyone that they're fine, that they still care, that they haven't become some cold, selfish person. The guilt is enormous. Decades of programming that says your worth comes from your usefulness to others doesn't dissolve overnight. It screams at you. It tells you that pulling away makes you a bad person, that people are hurting because of your absence, and you're responsible for that hurt. Jung was clear about this. The guilt is the old structure trying to survive. It has nothing to do with morality, and everything to do with a psychological pattern that doesn't want to die. The empath's role as emotional caretaker serves everyone in the system except the empath. And when the empath finally stops serving that function, the guilt they feel is the sound of the cage door opening. It sounds like alarm bells because the cage has been home for so long that leaving it feels like trespassing. So the empath who manages to stay in the disappearance, who resists the pull to return to the old arrangement, enters a phase that looks like nothing from the outside. They're home. They're quiet. They're doing unremarkable things, reading, walking, sitting with themselves in ways they've never actually done. And internally, something enormous is happening. Jung described individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, as requiring periods of withdrawal from the collective. The psyche needs space to reorganize, and it cannot reorganize while it's still entangled with everyone else's emotional material. This is why the disappearance feels so non-negotiable. The empath's unconscious is essentially clearing the room so it can do renovation work that's been postponed for years, sometimes for a lifetime. During the disappearance, the empath starts encountering parts of themselves they've never had access to, preferences they didn't know they had because they'd always deferred to what others wanted, anger they didn't know they were carrying because they'd been trained to convert anger into understanding, needs they'd never articulated because articulating a need meant risking the relationship. All of this material starts surfacing, and it's disorienting because the empath genuinely doesn't know some of these parts of themselves. They've been so busy being a mirror for everyone else that they never looked at their own reflection. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the shadow in the context of the over-adapted personality. The empath's shadow isn't primarily composed of darkness or cruelty, though those elements exist in everyone. The empath's shadow is full of refused selfhood. It contains the opinions they swallowed, the boundaries they never set, the anger they converted into empathy because anger felt dangerous, the ambitions they abandoned because pursuing something for themselves felt selfish. The shadow of the people-pleaser is the authentic person they never allowed themselves to be. Meeting this shadow is uncomfortable in a specific way. The empath has to sit with the recognition that much of their goodness was strategic. Their compassion, while real in many ways, was also a currency they used to purchase safety and belonging. Their availability was partly genuine care, and partly a way to guarantee they wouldn't be abandoned. Looking at this honestly doesn't erase the real love they've given, but it complicates it. And the empath has to hold that complexity without collapsing into shame about it or dismissing it as irrelevant. Jung found that patients who could tolerate this stage, who could look at their own patterns without either condemning themselves or defending themselves, were the ones who emerged from the disappearance fundamentally changed. The ones who couldn't tolerate it either returned to the old pattern prematurely or got stuck in a cynical phase where they decided all relationships were transactional and all people were users. Neither of those outcomes was individuation. They were just different forms of avoiding the truth, which was more layered and less comfortable than either extreme. If you've been doing this work, if you've been sitting in the quiet of your own disappearance, facing parts of yourself that have been buried under decades of caretaking, you already know how strange it feels. You might be wondering whether you'll ever want to come back, whether you've permanently lost your ability to connect, whether the warmth that used to define you has been replaced by something colder, something that might be better for you, but feels foreign in your own skin. This is where those 24 reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, can become something like a compass. Each one was designed around Jungian principles of honest self-encounter, the kind you're already doing, just with a structure that helps you stay with it instead of spiraling. The link is below if you want it, but the real work is what you're already doing by staying in the room with yourself. Because something is happening in that room, something Jung tracked across dozens of patients who went through this exact sequence. The empath who stays in the disappearance long enough begins to develop what he called a sovereign center of gravity. For their entire life, their center of gravity has been located in other people. Their mood depended on who they were around. Their sense of self shifted based on what was needed. Their emotional state was a composite of everyone else's emotional states, blended together so thoroughly that they couldn't separate their own feelings from the ones they'd absorbed. The disappearance relocates that center of gravity. Slowly, with a lot of confusion and some genuine loneliness, the empath starts discovering what they feel when no one else's feelings are in the room. What they want when no one else's wants are on the table. Who they are when they're not performing a function for someone else's emotional ecosystem. This relocation is what changes everything. And it's what makes the comeback so different from what people expect. Because the empath does come back. That's the part of the story that people in the middle of disappearing are afraid to believe. The withdrawal isn't permanent. The isolation isn't the destination. But the person who returns is someone the old system won't fully recognize. Jung documented this reemergence and found it had consistent characteristics across different patients, different cultures, different circumstances. The empath who had gone through genuine individuation during their disappearance came back with qualities that looked paradoxical to people who'd known them before. They were warmer, but less available, more compassionate, but harder to manipulate, more present in conversations, but less willing to carry them. They could sit with someone in pain without needing to fix the pain, absorb the pain, or make the pain about their own adequacy as a helper. They could listen completely and then go home and sleep well. The connection that used to drain them now energized them because it was flowing in two directions instead of one. The quiet comeback confuses people because it doesn't announce itself. The empath doesn't return with declarations about boundaries and self-care and how they've changed. They just show up differently. They respond to texts when they want to, and they don't respond when they don't. They attend gatherings they're genuinely interested in and decline the ones they're not, without manufacturing elaborate excuses. They ask questions instead of offering solutions. They stay present instead of performing presence. And people notice. Something has shifted, but it's hard to name. The empath feels more solid somehow, more there, even though they're doing less, more real, even though, or maybe because, they're no longer trying so hard to be what everyone needs. Jung described this quality as psychological weight. The person who has gone through individuation develops a kind of gravitas that comes from having met themselves honestly. They've looked at their shadow. They've sat with their own selfishness and their own fear and their own patterns of using helpfulness as a shield. And they've integrated those parts instead of performing their absence. That integration gives them a steadiness that's palpable. People feel it without understanding it. The empath has stopped vibrating at everyone else's frequency and found their own. This is where the old relationships get tested. Some of them survive the comeback. The people who genuinely loved the empath, who valued the actual person, not just the function they served, adjust. They might be confused at first. They might miss the old version, but they recognize that the person in front of them is more honest, more available in real ways, more capable of actual intimacy. And they adapt, because real love can accommodate growth even when growth is uncomfortable. But some relationships don't survive. And this is the part of the comeback that no one prepares the empath for. Because some of the people in their life didn't love them. They loved what the empath provided. They loved the emotional labor, the constant availability, the willingness to absorb. And when that function disappears, so does their interest. They drift away, or they get angry, or they launch campaigns to convince the empath that the old version was better, kinder, more lovable, which really means more useful. Jung found that empaths in this phase often experienced a second wave of the urge to disappear. Having returned and encountered who actually valued them versus who valued their function, the temptation to withdraw again was strong. But this second pull was different from the first. The first disappearance was involuntary, the psyche demanding space it had been denied. The second urge was a choice. And the mature response, Jung observed, wasn't to disappear again, but to stay present while allowing relationships to reorganize around the new reality. Some will fall away, let them. Some will deepen in ways that weren't possible before. Let that happen too. The quiet comeback isn't about returning to the old world with better boundaries. It's about discovering which parts of the old world were real and which were arrangements of convenience held together by the empath's willingness to sacrifice themselves. There's something else Jung noticed about the empath after the disappearance that deserves attention, because it's the quality that most clearly marks the transformation. The empath who has done this work develops the ability to be alone without being lonely, and to be with people without losing themselves. These sound simple, they're anything but. Before the disappearance, the empath experienced solitude as absence. Something was missing, someone should be there, the silence needed filling. And they experienced company as a demand. Someone needed something, emotions required processing, a role needed playing. Both states were exhausting because both were defined by other people, whether present or absent. After the disappearance, solitude becomes generative. The empath can sit in an empty room and feel full. They can spend a weekend alone and emerge rested rather than depleted. The silence they used to fill with other people's noise becomes the sound of their own life, and they discover it has a rhythm they actually enjoy. And company becomes a choice rather than an obligation. They enter rooms as themselves, not as the emotional first responder everyone expects. They can enjoy someone's presence without scanning for what that person needs. They can have a conversation that's actually a conversation, two people meeting as equals, instead of a therapy session disguised as friendship. This is what Jung meant by the transcendent function operating in relationship. The empath is no longer oscillating between the opposites of total merger and total withdrawal. They found a third position, present but distinct, connected but whole, empathic but sovereign. And that third position is what makes the quiet comeback so powerful. The empath hasn't stopped feeling. They haven't become cold or detached or indifferent. They've become something harder and rarer, someone who can feel deeply without being consumed by what they feel. People often ask how long the disappearance needs to last. Jung never gave a timeline, and I think that's intentional. The psyche doesn't operate on schedules. For some empaths, the withdrawal lasts a few months. For others, a year or more. The duration depends on how long the false arrangement was in place, how deeply the caretaking role was embedded, how much shadow material needs integration, and how much resistance the surrounding system puts up. But there are signs that the work is nearing completion. You stop missing the old version of yourself. You can think about people who left during your withdrawal without guilt or rage, just a kind of clean sadness, the way you'd feel about a house you once lived in that was never really yours. You catch yourself doing things purely because you want to, and the absence of guilt feels less disorienting. You can hear someone describe a problem without your body lunging forward to solve it. You start choosing relationships based on resonance rather than on who needs you most. These aren't dramatic shifts, they're quiet ones. They accumulate, and one day you realize you've been out of the disappearance for a while without noticing exactly when you emerged. The comeback doesn't have a start date, it has a slow dawn. Jung believed this cycle, the disappearance and the quiet return, was one of the most important developmental passages available to people with deep empathic capacity. Because the empath sensitivity, which the world so often treats as a weakness or a wound, becomes something entirely different on the other side of individuation. It becomes discernment. The same nervous system that used to absorb everyone's pain indiscriminately now reads emotional environments with precision and chooses how to respond rather than reacting automatically. The healed empath can still walk into a room and feel everything. They still perceive the tension between the couple in the corner, the anxiety radiating from the person by the door, the false performance of the one telling loud stories at the center. They feel all of it, but they hold it at perceptual distance instead of taking it into their body. They see the emotional landscape clearly, the way a pilot reads weather, with full awareness and without flying directly into the storm. This is the comeback the world doesn't understand. The empath returns, and everyone expects them to resume the old role, softer, more available, back to absorbing. Instead, they encounter someone who is fully present, but no longer for sale. Someone who loves fiercely, but chooses carefully. Someone whose compassion has weight behind it because it's no longer compulsive. The compassion of someone who has disappeared, met themselves, and chosen to come back is qualitatively different from the compassion of someone who never stopped giving because they were afraid to find out who they were without the giving. If you're in the disappearance right now, or if you can feel it approaching, that slow gravitational pull toward solitude, toward silence, toward the edges of your own social world, Jung would tell you to let it happen. Stop apologizing for it. Stop explaining it. Stop performing recovery for people who are uncomfortable with your absence. The disappearance is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's giving your psyche the first quiet room it's had in years, maybe ever. And in that room, you're going to discover things about yourself that couldn't surface while you were busy being everyone else's emotional infrastructure. You're going to discover preferences you forgot you had, anger you didn't know you were entitled to, a sense of self that doesn't depend on being needed. And those discoveries are going to reorganize your entire life, your relationships, your work, your daily rhythms, your sense of what you're willing to tolerate and what you're done carrying. The comeback will happen on its own timeline. You can't force it, and you don't need to. When the internal work reaches a certain depth, the desire to re-engage emerges naturally. You'll want to see people again, specific people, chosen people, people whose company doesn't cost you your center of gravity. You'll want to participate in the world again, but from a position you've never occupied before, your own. If any of this is landing, if you're hearing your own experience described back to you in ways that make the silence feel less frightening, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for exactly this stretch of the road. 24 Jungian reflection exercises, each one designed to help you stay with yourself during the parts of this process that feel the most disorienting. It's not a program that tells you what to find. It's a companion for the finding. The link is below.